Howdy, everybody. This is the first meeting of the Hands Off Central Texas Book Club Read for Democracy. You can follow the dedicated Instagram Read for Democracy, and you can also sign up for the newsletter to make sure that you always hear about it. This month we read The Trouble with Reality, the moral rumination of moral panic in our time, which sounds really long-winded, but was like less than 90 pages. If you want to read it after this, I don't think it'll take you too long. Sal and I both read it. Sal read it and has a bunch of topics that he wants to talk about, so we're excited to hear from that. Just a very quick note before we get started with our short discussion. For the people who joined us here in person, after this 20-minute live stream, we will hand it over to a group discussion, but it will be private, not live streamed, and we didn't invite the media. So if you want to join us next time, I believe it's on the 26th of October. It's already on our website, and you can sign up and RSVP on the website to make sure that you get reminders to come join a bunch of cool people who also think that everything's crazy and are trying to do something about it. So Sal, you read this very recently. I did my best to get through it.
Yeah.
I really thought there was so much information in the first couple of chapters that, and we had someone say just a minute ago, that it seems a little too late, the warning of when people weaponize lies to create a reality that is not true, but people feel inside themselves is true, because they're seeing constant affirmation in the media and on the news and from their neighbors. What do you think were your big takeaways? Because we're in this situation now. This book was written after the first administration. It's much worse this time around. What were your big takeaways? And we're going to end with what to do about it, so stay tuned for that. We're not just going to bum everyone out.
Yeah, so for those of you who haven't read this book, it's split over 5 chapters. One is in here referring to the systems of perception that we have within ourselves that allow us to construct reality. Like we might think we're perceiving facts, and we all kind of know and are aware that generally we distort reality, that we have biases, that we have things like that. But she really digs into, in that book, just exactly how much we're predisposed and hardwired to not just misperceive, but to be rewarded for misperceiving. How things like stereotypes are helpful constructs that allow us to just move through the world. And in this modern age, that ends up being something that's created quite a few problems in recent years, especially in this country. Out there is chapter 2, and that she goes from our internal systems of perceiving or misperceiving reality towards how those aggregate out unconsciously and consciously into the greater systems that we're all living in, whether it's the media or political systems, the law, and collective history. Into producing the sort of terrain that we've been navigating these past 10, 15 years, and that in 2016, Donald Trump exploited in order to rise to the presidency. Chapter 3, lying is the point. She delves deep, exploring concepts from writers Hannah Arendt, I believe Masha Gessen, if I'm getting that pronunciation correct, to speak to how it wasn't unconscious, it wasn't a sort of frenzy or reaction to just these biases or these systems, but alongside folks like Steve Bannon, Donald Trump and his team purposefully carried out what the book refers to as like lying rather than lies. Lies being individual lies that individuals can commit or that groups can commit. Lying as a concept of systematic lies that are meant to, not just through concepts like fire hose propaganda, overwhelm the truth and no longer allow us to kind of seek that out, but to use lies as weapons, meant to sort of silence us, meant to bring us into fold, meant to have us questioning everything that we used to see as shared reality. And in chapters 4 and 5, chapter 4 being recovering reality, chapter 5 being the reckoning, she speaks to not just the concepts of how we can go about by understanding these larger systematic, like out there forces, how we got to the place that we are, but how, to get back to the title of the book, moral rumination. Ruminating meaning going over and over and over again, speaking to how the process of recovering reality is possible, whether that's within the sphere of media, within the sphere of ourselves as individuals, necessarily ourselves as individuals, but how it's going to be like ruminating, a continual process, perpetual, something that we have to do over and over and over again, because we're not only having to navigate this distorted, undone reality and the shared morals that we used to have with each other, or that we used to perceive were perennial and extant, but that we have to overcome our own biases on a continual basis in order to do this. I think that got to it, but can you remind me just?
Well, the end was what to do about it. And it was very brief because the book's very brief, but it was also very encouraging. She talked a little bit about the concepts of protest, what it works for, what it doesn't work for, and basically just says everyone strap in because this is going to be a long fight to rebuild a communal sense of reality. Although I would argue that I don't think we ever had a communal sense of reality. You know, a big part of the civil rights movement in the 60s was illustrating through nonviolent civic disobedience and violence and all sorts of things to point out that there was this huge section of Americans and conversely another huge section of Americans that were experiencing two totally separate realities that were both so sure. And you know, one group was right, they were experiencing all of this systemic racism and harm. The other group was by and large ignoring it or perpetuating it. And so there is a truth objectively, I think. And I think that humans, we need to feel that there's an objective sense of truth. But I would argue that we've never had a cohesive sense of reality. And one of the big things that we run into when we look at America versus other smaller countries that are more homogenous is that because we're so diverse, culturally, ethnically, linguistically, we are never going to get everyone on exactly the same page, right? You mentioned at the beginning stereotypes, which I thought were really interesting. On page 8, I highlighted a bit that was talking about back in the 1920s, a journalist and critic, Walter Lippmann, introduced stereotypes in this psychological sense, talking about how basically if we know someone personally, like I know Sal personally, then I can see through any surface level stereotypes to his humanity. But if we can't possibly know everyone that we encounter, even in our own communities, much less the whole of America personally, right? We look over there and then we slot somebody on a news story or on a YouTube video or across the street into stereotypes because our brain likes to organize.
Yeah, and in getting to the point of like, what are we going to do about it? What can be done about it? I think it's really essential that you turn towards the examples of the civil rights movement because that's just key. That's something that we're all sort of even taught from a young age. A lot of us who went through grade school, even just in this room, were taught at least a simple version of the civil rights movement and can at least approach that. And that sort of speaks to, I think, how they're, if not a shared value system that we all shared, I think it goes to the heart of a line that I've heard kind of over and over from candidates or from movements in the political space over the past, especially 10 years, where there's this idea of an America that we were always all fighting for, which is up until Donald Trump, though our system, our Constitution was never perfect, it had within itself towards a better union, towards a better and more perfect union. That core concept being that like within our laws, within our practices, within our beliefs, was the Constitution ever perfect? No. Has it always protected everybody in this country? Absolutely not. We can see it within the text itself, how it was revised to eventually more free people and to give the vote to like everybody who lives in this country.
Except felons.
Yeah, except felons. And within that system, though, there's always the sense of there was something that could be harnessed by the people that were being oppressed by the Constitution to recapture it towards this ideal So that Langston Hughes line, America, America, the country that is not but must be, is maybe underlying like this core concept of what used to be there. But the reason there's a difference between Donald Trump and the disillusionment that the author speaks to post-World War I, where there was this grand disillusionment of, oh, progress is guaranteed or ensured by technology, as the separate example that she really kind of like delved into, that was a truly systematic undoing of this general belief, regardless of whether you were Dixiecrat in the South, Woodrow Wilson, Republicans in the Midwest, whomever. There's this general belief or a shared sort of idea of progress. Here, the thing that's being undone is the very foundation of our country itself, this idea that we are meant to continually be improving this country, continually modifying it to make it more accessible, more equal to everybody. So I think there's a difference between her highlighting and speaking to how there are very often parallel realities, how in fact we're all always living, each of us as individuals, with our own internal parallel reality, such as in chapter 1, versus how we can, through processes of groupthink and culture and community, join in to groups, or whether, again, consciously or unconsciously, and occupy lanes where you're thinking this is reality. Reality means like small government, less taxes, or reality means like let's use this government to improve and change and transform the lives towards the betterment of everybody. Versus what Trump is doing now, where he is trying to just undo the concept of reality itself through the weaponization of lying, through the systematic fire hosing of lies, to the point where it's we find ourselves in the place that we're often at now, which is like, how do we even proceed? How do we, it feels like we spend so much time connecting or trying to connect, even just within the spaces of, on the left, democratic spaces, progressive spaces, even just trying to find common ground there in that space where we still hold that old ideal. How do we even begin to go into the spaces where people are just now completely off track? It can feel like this is just the natural outcome of the America that has never had a total shared perceived reality. But there was always this, what's important when we're talking like what's to be done, there was always this belief that underlying everything, there is this.
Like forward momentum?
Well, not forward momentum, but that at the heart of our laws, at the heart of our country and culture, that the individual is the basis of everything, that our laws allow for freedom of speech, and that freedom of speech means you have a point of view, great. I have a point of view, great. If we disagree, then we argue it out with the people. They vote whosever idea is best, and just at the concept of this country is like, we should be able to say anything we want to without fear of being either murdered or hurt, but even just like shamed, ridiculed, undone.
Yeah, I think when you bring that up, it brings up a lot of things, because she talks about the media a lot, and there's a lot of reasons why we're in this situation. A big one is the media, but it's not the only one, right? Because what she talks about is that the Constitution basically asks the media to be a check on power of elected officials and the government, but doesn't really give them public funding to do that. So the media gets, PBS aside, the media gets funding from viewership, and if you can hack people's emotions, if you can hook their fight, flight, freeze, fear, emotionality, then they'll tune back into your show the next day. And so when we stopped the equal time doctrine during the Reagan administration, we were fucked. When, we have the normalization of, a huge platform that everyone in America is on that's controlled by one dude with his own political opinions, like that fucks us. There's so many ways in which being reliant on media, which is owned by a hyper few, like all of American media by and large, it used to be just newspapers. Then it was radio, newspapers. Then it was radio, newspapers, TV. Now it's a ton of digital things on top of all the old stuff. And we used to, in the 90s, have about 50 companies that owned all the major media conglomerates. Now it's about 5 companies that own all of it. And if you can control those 5, you can control all of the major news outlets that all of America is listening to. So it's been really interesting because I think one of the shared senses of reality that all Americans have had in the past couple of years is a shared sense of gaslighting, of being gaslit by media, whether or not it's for or against the administration, not using the right words to talk about stuff, you know, using words that kind of like calm the problem down, that don't communicate, you know, that something's illegal because they say it's like a, you know, unexpected or radical, when what they really mean is this shit is unconstitutional and it shouldn't be happening. And I think that it's not just the media's fault either, because we as individuals choose to tune into things, choose to prop up their advertising, that it's partially on us. And then I also think she brings up an interesting point, I don't remember where it is, but right at the beginning she brings an interesting point up that says, you know, they were very optimistic when they wrote the Constitution because they were assuming that individuals would all constantly work on the government. And that doesn't happen when the economy gets better, right? When things are harder for families, then people get together and they work on improving things, right? The civil rights movement is the really big example that I think we all learned in our public school. But when the economy started getting better in like my parents' generation, people get complacent. They stop paying attention. When people are complacent, then the, you know, perpetual literal white supremacist families that raise their children to try to commit genocide against everyone else, they don't have as many eyes on them. They can pull civics classes out of high schools, and then suddenly no one knows how the government works. No one knows how to register to vote. No one knows how to do their taxes. No one knows that 80% of your tax dollar really just goes to give corporations kickbacks. Like, there's so many problems that we're at because we're in this cycle, maybe the worst point of the cycle of complacency. Things have gotten bad again. Now we all have to, you know, gear up to take back our country, and then probably this cycle will just keep perpetuating, whether it's our country or the next country, because you see cyclicals every couple of generations. Fascism tries to come back.
Yeah, and this is why I think this was a really great and relevant choice for book club this month, because in this book we've got, it's moral rumination, but it's also just historical rumination over this country. And when you're speaking to how things have just run away from us, how it was things that the founders couldn't possibly have conceived of or looked like predicted, whether it's social media, conglomerates aggregating all of media into just a few blocks and monopolies. Those are things the founders couldn't have perceived. And she does speak to the almost idealism or the optimism of the founders, but I think something that is there that wasn't quite as explored as I would have liked is how much they're allowing for the press as to be independent of government at that time was coming from a place of protectiveness and fear over the thing they're really trying to protect, which is freedom of speech. The protection of those individuals, as limited and, you know, actually unequal as that was at the time of the founding of the country, it really did come down to, we want anybody to be able to stand up in a public space and say what they want. Now, of course, one of those runaway aspects or tendencies is that by 2015, 2016, we had a Donald Trump able to sort of like galvanize and speak and literally say anything that he wanted to. And in the new environment that we're in, post stripping down of PBS resources, post Reagan, in a media sphere, like with social media as like new components that were just beginning to really gamify and learn how to get to people's emotions, audience targeting, that all led to this like perfect storm scenario where Trump was able to activate not just like the mental internal things going on in here, but also just all of the aspects and systems out there. So I think considering that the United States the founding fathers saw the media as this thing that was outside of the government by necessity. I think one of the questions, and she's asking us to continually question ourselves, question our biases or stereotypes, like our conception of reality, is like, one of the first questions to ask is like, why did PBS ever come about in the first place? Like, do we know the history of PBS? Why is it that in a country that was founded so sure with this idea that you can't limit free speech, that government shouldn't have a role in the media, did some 150 years later, or whenever it was, that PBS was seen to get founded? Is because I think a first step towards returning to shared values and towards getting back there's understanding our history in all of its arcs, and not just in individual case-by-case basis, but in the systematic way. In the same way she says we shouldn't just get stuck on trying to capture individual lies, but to really question and perceive systematic systems of lying, or systems that are trying to undo our sense of reality. In that sense, we can look at PBS as a perfect example where we see why in the 20th century what did the government see, and what did the people who brought this issue and forced government to make these changes, what were they experiencing already in the 20th century where they said, no, we need something public, something regulated, because this is rampant, this is all over the place.
We are out of time, and I think it's important to end on what she ended on, was what to do. And it does feel quaint, somebody said quaint a second ago, on, she says, focus on policies that matter to you, call your congressperson. Protests are great, but they have to be really coordinated and have like a really clear objective to be specifically useful. It's interesting to hear this kind of stuff in a book, because like you said, fighting individual lies is important, but you can get bogged down yelling at someone on Facebook when you could take that same energy and go yell at your staffer at the local level, someone who will actually get scared by you, because the congressional staffers don't get scared. And they're made of sterner stuff, they get yelled at more often. But I think it's really interesting because we did promise to end this segment, although we'll have a longer discussion in person here at the library. We promised to end this segment with next steps. And the big next step this month is, in like a few weeks, early voting starts. I'm talking about the November 4th election of this year. That's not midterms. We're not getting rid of the governor. That's next year. You got to make sure that you're registered to vote. Obviously, that has to be done in person or by mail in Texas. And there is a giant voter registration backlog right now. Travis County is 10,000 voter registration applications behind. You can call the Secretary of State's office. You can call your county and express concern about that. Ask them how they're going to guarantee that everyone's ready to go by October 20th, which is the first day of early voting. But you also, on that individual level, need to make sure that everyone you know has checked their voter registration, because they pull us off rolls all the time. And if you're suspended, you can still vote, but it does scare people off when they get to the polls and they hear they're suspended. So votetexas.gov is where you go to double check that all your information is correct, that you know where you're supposed to be voting, that you're registered in your correct county, all that kind of jazz. And now at the top of the Hands Off Central Texas website, just a couple of hours ago, I uploaded a PDF that tells you what to do if you get to the polls, what to bring to the polls, and what to do if you get to the polls and you're suspended. So that's the really big call to action this month. Is we have an election coming up in like 22 days. So we got to make sure that we're on top of it. The big part of the election is 17 constitutional amendments. That's state level, so Texas state constitution, 17 proposed amendments that would basically change it, update it. There's a couple of things that I think will be good. There's a lot of things that have to do with taxes. And we're not endorsing voting any particular way, but I have heard a lot of people say, I'm just going to vote no on everything, as if that's some kind of protest. It's not really. So definitely go to the League of Women Voters website. They have ballot guides for the constitutional amendments in like every conceivable language. So make sure that everyone you know has access to all the information they need. And of course, you can DM us with questions or for us to direct you. So if you're watching us online, thank you so much for being with us. Join us next week or next month in person to have a discussion with a lot more people that also want to make sure that we live in a democracy next year. And we're going to turn it over to the group discussion here at the library for everyone to talk and talk about what we're going to do to work together to get us all back on the same page, or at least make sure the people that are on the page that's trying to install a dictator don't have the ability to keep doing that. So thanks very much, y'all, and we'll see you next month.
Thanks, y'all.